And is there a raise your hand thing there too? Nope. Okay. And we'll try to get to all the questions, those that we can't answer during the time after the presentation. We'll try to get answers to them put up as a Q&A afterwards. The whole webinar is being recorded and will be posted. Thanks for joining us. Mike?
All right. Hi, everyone. Mike Judge. So I'm just going to go through a few slides that we've prepared, reviewing filing process, some common errors, and other things that I think are useful for filers to know. And then we'll spend the bulk of the webinar going through the actual filing form itself. So just to start, or just a review of the filing process, you should have already received your bank totals from DOER in an email provided on May 8th. So this is your bank totals of certificates that you have available for compliance this year from 2012 and 2013. You should have also received your retail load obligation. So this is the obligation, the amount of load that you served last year, and that's the basis on which your compliance obligations are determined. And that should have been provided last month. So if you haven't received those, let us know after this, and we'll figure out why. Just a reminder, the end of the trading year is June 15th. So coming up very soon. Alternative compliance payments must be submitted to the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center by June 25th, and the actual filings are due no later than July 1st. Filers are required to provide both hard and electronic copies of their filing, and electronic copies should be submitted to the DOER.RPS inbox.
Yeah, please send them only there so we don't fill up our personal boxes at DOER. And it's most important to get the electronic filings in by that day. If your paper filing arrives a day or two afterwards, that's not the end of the world. Almost, but not quite.
All right, so moving on, wanted to review a few compliance exemptions. These are not applicable to most suppliers, or the first two are not applicable to most suppliers anymore, but there are three different compliance exemptions that exist for 2014, and all of them have their own page in the workbook. So the first is the pre-2009 exemption for Class 2 and APS, which exempts all load that was served under contracts last year, contracts that were executed prior to January 1st, 2009. So any load that was served under these pre-2009 contracts is not obligated to comply with the Class 2 or APS minimum standards. The pre-2010 load for a solar carve-out exemption, this is not actually an outright exemption, but rather exempts load served under contracts that were executed prior to January 1st, 2010 from paying the full solar carve-out ACP rate. So instead of paying the $523 rate, I believe it is, for 2014, you'd pay the roughly $66 Class 1 rate for any load that was under contract signed prior to January 1st, 2010. This allows, the suppliers cannot bank, or cannot both bank and make ACPs at the Class 1 rate. A number of suppliers with this exemption tried to do this last year. So if you are eligible for this, you should know that you cannot also bank SRECs above your compliance obligation if you avail yourselves of the opportunity to make ACPs at the Class 1 rate. And I'll go through that in an example later when we go through the filing form. If you do overpurchase SRECs, you are able to make deposits into our Solar Credit Clearinghouse auction account. So that is open through the 15th for deposits, and we encourage anyone that wants to participate as a depositor to make those deposits by the 15th. Lastly, this is a new compliance obligation for this year, the SREC 2, or Solar Carve-Out 2 obligation. And the exemption that applies in this case is only for competitive retail suppliers. It does not extend to the distribution companies, regulated distribution companies. And it exempts all load that was served in 2014 under contracts that were executed prior to April 25th, 2014. So any load you served last year under these contracts that were executed or extended prior to that date would be exempt. So just going through some strategies and some best practices, and these are kind of common things that we see issues with. One, I think, is a somewhat new concept to the market. People have been asking a lot of questions about how auction SRECs work, particularly SRECs that exist in the market that were auctioned off in 2012 or 2013. So just to be clear, auction SRECs from 2012 or 2013 are eligible to be used for compliance through 2015 and 2016, respectively. So if you have a 2012 auction certificate, vintage 2012 auction certificate, it's eligible for compliance in 2013, 14, or 15.
So unlike bank certificates, these each have a 3-year shelf life.
Yeah, exactly. And they're tradable commodities, and they do not need to be settled in a GIS subaccount in order to remain available for use in future years. You can simply do nothing with them. If you have them, then you don't have to present them for compliance. You don't have to place them in a reserved account. They will not be listed as unsettled certificates at the end of the year. They will just remain as tradable, transferable certificates in your account when the next trading year begins on July 15th. So because of that, we would suggest that these may have more value if you use them for compliance in 2015 or 2016 when the SREC market is expected to be undersupplied. It may make much more sense from a compliance standpoint to use these SRECs, which have this flexibility, in a year when SREC prices are going to be much higher or you'd be paying ACP. Given the market situation in 2014 is a very oversupplied market, you may be able to purchase 2014 SRECs at a cheaper rate and use these auction SRECs to offset more expensive compliance obligations in 2015 or 2016.
We're not telling you what you have to do, of course. We're just providing some advice about considerations that may lead to your decision about what's best for you.
Exactly. Another item here, banking certificates. As always, we recommend that suppliers avail themselves of their ability to bank certificates whenever possible. Just to be clear, and as a reminder, banking limits are expressed as a percentage of a supplier's 2014 obligation and can be used in one of the following 2 compliance years. So if you bank anything this year, it can be used for compliance in either 2015 or 2016. There are limits for each class of RECs and certificates that you're buying. So for RPS Class 1, the banking limit is 30% of your Class 1 obligation. SREC 1 and SREC 2 is 10%. Class 2 renewables 30%. Waste to energy is 0%, and this is only in 2014 and 2015. We removed the ability to bank last year in a regulatory change. So you can use bank certificates from prior years to meet compliance this year, but you cannot bank certificates above and beyond your compliance obligations. So if you have WECs above that obligation, you won't be able to use them for anything. And then lastly, the alternative portfolio standard has a banking limit of 30%. The last thing I'd mention here is we really strongly encourage everyone to settle all your certificates in your Massachusetts subaccounts at the GIS before June 15th. This is what is required for compliance. And in the past, we have allowed certificates that are not actually settled in a subaccount or either reserved or unsettled or be settled in a different state subaccount. We've allowed them to come in for compliance, but that has to be approved by us, and we refer to these as errant certificates. They can really create serious accounting issues and make it difficult for us to reconcile numbers. So really just reminding you the 15th is the deadline to settle these things, and we request that you please settle those certificates before the close of the trading year. ACP payments must be made to the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center by June 25th. To obtain instructions on how to submit these and the notification forms, please contact Danielle Boston at the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center. Her contact information is provided here and in the instructions that were sent to you last Friday. And when you make these payments, you need to itemize them according to the different types of ACPs that you're making. So there's 7 types for the 6 classes of RPS. So you have Class 1, SRECs at the Class 1 rate, SRECs at the full SREC ACP rate, SREC 2s, Class 2 renewable energy, Class 2 waste, and the APS. The CEC will provide an ACP receipt for each type of ACP that you remit to them, and these receipts must be included as part of your filing. If you haven't received your ACP receipts by July 1st, please don't delay emailing your compliance filing. Rather, email the filing, and you can provide us the ACP receipts at a later date as soon as you receive them.
This year, we'd like all of these receipts sent by email. In the past, we've taken them either hard copy or email. Just email, please.
And lastly, before we move into the form, just a reminder, we will be holding an auction this year, and the auction account is open for deposits. We'll be making some announcements about the rules and parameters of the auction next week. And it will be held, as always, it will be held before the end of July. We do expect there to be a significant volume in the SREC 1 auction this year, but we don't expect to hold an SREC 2 auction as the market is seemingly undersupplied, pretty significantly undersupplied. All deposits into the auction account must be made by June 15th, and bidders will need to register by submitting a qualification form to DOER's auction agent. This will be included in the forms that are provided next week, and we'll send out a stakeholder announcement as soon as those are available.
That's the registration. That's something they would do after the filing date. After the compliance filing date. Don't stop to do that now.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a complicated form. It's a one-page form. So, but it'd be done after the 15th at any rate. We do expect considerable bidder interest this year and strongly encourage all retail suppliers to participate because we feel that it does represent a significant opportunity for suppliers to reduce their compliance costs, especially given the current 2015 and 2016 SREC prices, which are trading significantly above the $300 auction price. So to the extent that you can buy certificates at $300 that are usable in 2015, 16, and potentially 2017, we would strongly encourage that you consider participating and placing a bid in the auction. So with that, I will move on to the actual compliance form, and we'll walk through that slide by slide.
I'll make that a lot bigger.
So let me enlarge this.
I'll make that part of this.
So,
it comes out bigger on their screen.
Yeah, okay.
You only see what's above the stuff.
Yeah, okay. So we made a few changes this year to the form. There's a number of new worksheets added that will hopefully make it easier to fill out and provide clearer information and data for both you and us. And one of the first things that we did is this first page, very straightforward page. This is taken out of the instructions and placed into the filing form, and it's just the contact information for the individuals that are actually preparing the filing. So this first section, you list who the retail supplier is, you list any other names that the supplier may be referred to as, and you list the contact person for the filing, and an additional contact person if necessary, and then lastly, the authorized representative. So this is the individual that will be actually signing the compliance filing form that is submitted to us.
Yeah, if you really want more than 2 contact people, send it separately by email, please.
So moving on to the next slide. This is also a new worksheet, and this is just some preliminary information that populates onto other tabs and provides information to us. So Table 1A here is for where you list your retail products and the load obligations. So these load obligations were provided to you last month, but here you have the opportunity to list out multiple products should you have them. Most suppliers typically only list one product on their filing form, but there are a handful that have multiple products that they list. So here you can see we've just listed a basic retail load and then also a 50% green product, which we'll get into a little bit later. Down below, I haven't filled these out yet. These are really just information on the disposition of your SRECs. Given that SRECs are a carve-out of Class 1 and can be placed into the auction or retired voluntarily or used for Class 1 compliance, we found it useful for us, at least, to document exactly where they end up. But we recognize that you might not be able to fill this out or want to fill this out until you've actually gone through the other forms. So to the extent you aren't able to fill this out until you've looked through the actual filing forms for Solar Carve-Out and Solar Carve-Out 2, we'd encourage you to go to those first and then come back to this after, which I'll do here.
But before you file, before you do your actual filing, you have to finish these forms, these tables.
So this next one this next worksheet is the Solar Carve-Out 2 load exemption. So this is only for competitive suppliers, and it's where you document exactly how much load was served under exempt contracts versus non-exempt contracts. So this first column here that you have to fill out is the total electricity supplied in each month of 2014. This data should match exactly the data that we provided to you last month. So the monthly totals that are in those files that were provided to you should be listed here. This next column is just the number of contracts that represents. And then this third column and the final column is how much electricity was supplied each month under contracts executed or extended before April 25th. So this is really just accounting for how much of these load figures, monthly load figures, how many of those megawatt hours were under these exempt contracts versus non-exempt. So one thing that we really encourage you to look at this and make sure that it actually makes sense. We had many suppliers last year make mistakes on this form, and it took considerable time to kind of go back and forth. And one thing to look at in particular is it's not possible to serve load under a contract that was signed after April 25th before April 25th. We had a number of suppliers list a lower figure in this column than in this column, and that resulted in some non-exempt load. So for the first 3 months, these rows should be 0 right here. You shouldn't be seeing any non-exempt load until after this, unless you're a regulated distribution company where the exemption doesn't apply. So moving on to below here, most of this information will calculate and pull in, but one thing you will have to enter in is if you have multiple products, or even if you have one product, you will have to enter information into this column. So at the end, when you finish this form, this number should match this number, this number should match this one, and this one should match this one. So you do have to enter in these two and enter in these two.
What you see in columns A and B there actually get copied from the previous form, from table 1.
Yeah. But these ones in the white actually get copied from here. So this is just really a check to make sure that the totals are all adding up. Lastly, on this page, this is just for planning purposes for us and for market information to give people a sense of what the future exemptions, future amounts of exempt load will be. We actually collected this data last year from you on this, but this will be just an update on that. So here you list the number of contracts that will be exempt at the start of each year, or that you expect to be exempt at the start of each year, and then the projected amount of megawatt hours that will be served under each one of those contracts for each of the next 5 years.
We don't expect the figures in that last column to turn out necessarily to be spot on, because they are projections.
Yeah.
And you don't really know exactly. It's your best estimate of what you figure on selling those years.
Exactly.
Into those contracts.
So moving on to the next one, this is another exemption, very similar in structure to the previous tab, and there will only be a handful of suppliers that this actually applies for.
And they already know this.
Yeah, and they know. So they've filled this out in the past. But similar structure, you list this actually should match exactly the numbers that we provided to you and the numbers here on this prior tab. You can copy and paste these numbers if you'd like over into this one. But here you list the number of pre-2009 contracts and the amount of megawatt hours that were served under those pre-2009 contracts, and that would be exempt. And then below, again, similar to the previous page, list any future projections of exempt load that you may expect to serve.
apply to you. Just don't fill anything out.
Exactly.
And anything that as a result turns up to be a 0 that gets copied to another page, well, that's what it is.
Yep.
Don't worry about it.
This next tab is for errant certificates. So to the extent that you have, hopefully no one has to use this, but to the extent that you do have certificates that were not settled in a Massachusetts subaccount for compliance, and you have had those certificates approved by us to be used for compliance, this is where you list them. So you list which subaccount or product that it's applying to, the generation unit name as listed at the GIS, the fuel or technology of that unit, the month in which the certificates were generated, and then the quantity by type. So you should never have more than one type listed on here. This is either it's going to be a Class 1 rec or it's going to be an SREC, or a Class 2 rec. This is where you document that.
You could have more than one row on one of those type columns, of course.
Yeah. These totals are copied directly into the workbook. So if you do have any, I'll show you where that goes on this next tab, which is the Class 1 tab. The exempt load number from that prior tab, not the exempt load, the errant certificates is copied directly here, just so that you can make sure that these two numbers match. So having moved on to this is the Class 1 compliance calculation tab. And here you see this information was pulled in from the first preliminary tab. And then these are automatically calculated values. And this is where you enter in your certificates that you're presenting for compliance. So this first column are actual vintage 2014 certificates that you are retiring for compliance. The second column is errant certificates that you're presenting for compliance. This third one is bank certificates from 2012. And the fourth and final is bank certificates from 2013. So here you see that in this case, the supplier procured over almost 124,000 certificates, vintage 2014 certificates, had 500 errant, and then 1,000 banked from a prior year that they're using for compliance. This all adds up to a total of 125,000 certificates as compared to a compliance obligation of a little over 100,000, which then results in a surplus of almost 25,000. And this column here shows the limit on banking. As this is below that limit, the supplier is able to bank all 25,000 certificates. Just as an example of what would happen if you were short on compliance, let's just change this amount that's being presented here. So here, now the supplier has a shortage, and that's reflected over here in that they have to make just over 5,000 ACPs at the Class 1 rate, and they have 0 certificates being banked. Moving on to the next one, nearly identical. This is just for the solar carve-out. So here you see that the supplier has a surplus again and is planning to bank 172 certificates. There is an issue with this that I'll get to later because they're also claiming some 2010 exemption, and I'll explain the issue with that a little bit later. Solar carve-out 2. This is slightly different formatting here because it's pulling in information from a couple different sources on the exemption that applies here. So as you can see, there was 1.25 million megawatt hours served by the retail supplier last year. Of that, almost 1.1 million was exempt, and the remainder was non-exempt. So the obligation for SREC 2 is only calculated on this number. So it's this number multiplied by the 0.0843%, which results in this compliance obligation total over here. So this is actually far more than they needed. But let's just assume here that they've procured 93 certificates out of a total obligation of, what is that, Howard? 153? And because they didn't procure enough, they have to make 60 ACPs. Moving on to the Class 2, very similar to the other sheets again, does account for exempt load should that apply. So this column pulls in the exempt load from Table 3, and this is what the obligation is calculated on. And so here you see that the supplier has procured 15,000 certificates, vintage 2014 certificates, banked 5,000, and that is short of the 21,333 they needed for compliance, so they owe 1,300 ACPs. This is the Class 2 waste. Again, this very similar to the last one for the Class 2 renewable. Here you see that the supplier has met their obligation exactly with a combination of bank certificates and RECs. One thing to note, as I mentioned earlier, the limit on banking is 0% this year. So if a supplier was to present more certificates than needed, you end up seeing they have a surplus amount of certificates, 15,000 here, but 0 of those are eligible to be banked. So do pay attention to that. And then lastly, the APS, again, very similar to the Class 2 renewable and waste to energy. Here, the supplier has procured 10,000 certificates and has to make a substantial amount of ACPs. So moving on to the green tab, most suppliers will not have to use this. This is used only to document green power products that represent Class 1 RECs, the retirement of Class 1 RECs. So if you have a green power product offering that does not include Massachusetts, the retirement of Massachusetts Class 1 RECs, you do not need to list it here. This is only for the purpose of capturing information on Class 1 RECs that were retired as part of a green product offering, so that those can be retired and in the RGGI market. So as you can see, the supplier procured 50,000. This was a 50% green product, or served 50,000 megawatt hours, 50% green. So they procured 25,000 Class 1 RECs to meet that 50%. This tab is one that's been around for a few years now and is similar to the exemptions. It's designed to calculate the amount of load that is eligible to be met using Class 1 ACPs. So this is SREC ACP calculation here. It starts very similar to the other exempt load tabs in that we're asking for the number of contracts that were signed prior to 2010 that were in effect each month, and the amount of megawatt hours served under those contracts. So that adds up to this total over here, and then you do have to enter into this cell the amount of megawatt hours that were served. Should match this, but this does include line losses. So to the extent that these don't, this number may differ slightly. But this number is actually the number that gets populated down below. So here, again, we have some future planning purposes where you're able to provide projections on how many megawatt hours will be served under exempt contracts. And then down below, this is where the actual ACP is calculated. So this doesn't apply to most suppliers, but there are a handful that does. Here you see that there were 110,000 megawatt hours under pre-2010 contracts, which entitles the supplier to make 1,043 payments at the Class 1 rate. However, they have presented more SRECs than they need for compliance, so they are unable to make those Class 1 payments. If they choose to avail themselves of the opportunity to make those payments, they would have a surplus amount of SRECs that they would have to do something with. They could either retire those voluntarily, use them as Class 1 RECs, or what most suppliers opted to do in this situation last year, deposit them into the auction account. So in order to do that, you'd actually have to subtract out 1,043 certificates from here, as well as the 172 that are being banked, which is a total of, what is that, like 1 minute here. It's a total of 1,215, so we'd have to take that out of this total here. So you'd end up putting in 10,285 in this instance, and that would equal the number that was shown here. So now you're seeing there's 1,043 ACPs being made, and those 1,043 ACPs match the amount of ACPs that this supplier is eligible to make at that Class 1 rate.
So what happens to the others?
The others have to be transferred into the auction account,
Oh, right.
or used for Class 1 compliance,
Right.
or voluntarily retired. But
Right.
most likely, people would choose to transfer them into the auction account.
That's your financially your best option.
So that gets back to this preliminary tab. So before, I don't remember the amount that was presented actually. Let's see, give me 1 second here. So there were 11,975 certificates procured by the supplier. And then of those, 1,215 were deposited into the auction account because of this. So that leaves 10,760 presented for compliance, and that would be the number that you enter in this. And then that gets copied into your solar carve-out, and as long as this number matches this number, you filled out the preliminary tab correctly and accounted for all of the SRECs that you purchased. Many suppliers may not have to do this because you may not deposit anything into the auction account. It may just be simply you put in this number and then you re-enter it down here. But if you, to the extent you do have SRECs that you've done something else with, whether that be put them into the auction account, retire them, or count them toward the green product, or you use them to Class 1 compliance, we want to be able to account for that and know exactly where the certificates went. And then you would do the same thing for SREC 2.
And then, like the individual information on all of the pages, this shows up in an aggregated form on the annual compliance report. No one is ever going to know how many your company in particular, what you did with what.
Exactly. So lastly, this form is a new form designed to help you calculate ACPs. So this pulls in the ACP totals from each of the prior tabs and multiplies them by the ACP rate, so you can see exactly how much ACP you owe for each class. And this will allow you to easily itemize your payments to the Clean Energy Center when you do make the ACP payments. This, you don't actually enter any information here. This is just all automatically calculated from prior tabs. So this is just for your information and to make sure that everything's being accounted correctly.
And note that reminder right under the table. You do not round up any of those dollar figures. You do not round them up or down. Pay them exactly as they are, because that is what you owe, and that the law requires that we collect what is owed.
Exactly. Just lastly, these are, again, things that you don't have to fill out anything in this form. This is a certification form, which was in prior years in the instructions form. But this pulls in information from prior tabs, so it pulls in your name, the retail supplier's name, the name of the authorized representative, and then this needs to be printed and signed. So this is the document that is certifying that the authorized representative has examined this and that everything is accurate and correct, and this is the final submission.
And it is signed twice.
Signed twice, exactly. And lastly, this final authorization is the authorization of that authorized representative. So this is the proof that they have the ability to act in that capacity. So again, pulls in the retail supplier's name, pulls in the name of the authorized representative, and then you type in a basis on which, or write in a basis on which this individual is authorized to act in this capacity, someone signs to that, and then this has to be notarized. So both certification forms we need original hard copies of with your hard copy filing.
Yeah, with the emailed filing, we expect to see no signatures there, and possibly not an explanation. Depends on whether you fill it out before or after you send in the electronic filing. But then after you send in your electronic filing, you're going to print out the whole filing anyway, and at that point you get those two signed and notarized, filled in as requested.
So with that concludes our presentation. We'll run through any questions that we may have received, and we'll start doing that now. So just give us a second. So
we see the questions. Oh boy, pretty small. What support is needed for load contracting prior to 425?
So we don't actually require you to provide copies of contracts. They must be provided upon request if we ask for it. So we don't actually require any backup documentation. I don't know that we've ever gone after anyone for that information in the past, but to the extent we feel it would be necessary to do that, we could request that you provide evidence. What evidence that would be, I think, is yet to be determined.
No, actually, it's detailed in a guideline that was issued a couple of years ago.
Okay.
I forget which guideline it is, but it's identified in the instructions what guideline has. I think originally it was the guidelines for the Class 2 and APS exemption. So that's the one that's referred to, and so we're just picking up the same requirements. I'm sure there is. Is that the only question?
Wow.
Come on. Got to be more than that.
So that's our only question. If anyone has any other questions, you can type them on the right-hand side of your screen. You should be able to see that. There's a box there.
And we have had questions come in by email before this, and I think we've answered them in the context of subsequent emails, especially the one about the corrected workbook that went out Wednesday?
Mm-hmm.
No, Thursday morning.
Yeah.
And we'll do that again. Because if there's a question of any kind of general interest, we'll want everybody to hear the answer. We have one more question. Oh, they're coming in. Terrific. You were so busy paying attention that you didn't stop to write questions. Okay, for mergers that occurred in 2014, how should we handle retirements? I assume you mean retirements of the compliance certificates, the RECs, the AICs, the WECs, SRECs. Those would go into whichever sub-accounts you are using for compliance. You may actually have sub-accounts that are identified with the company whose load you purchased, whose contracts you purchased, and they can all be there. Or if you, I suggest you check with James Webb at the Equal GIS about that. To the extent that you can transfer quarter 4 load obligations, that means the obligation to deliver electricity. To the extent that you can transfer those from one account to another, you could so you may end up being able to merge the data into one sub-account. Then you can show the certificates all in that one sub-account. When you actually do your filing, you may be sending quarterly reports that come from more than one, that look like they're identified with more than one company if you are responsible for compliance by the end of the year for both of those. And there certainly are several of those for 2014. We have more questions. Will we be able to contact you in the event that questions come up as we fill out the form? Yes.
Either of us.
Yeah, either this is Howard, either me or Mike. I'll be leaving a little early today. So, and Mike will be here.
Yeah.
You can also email them. I'll probably check my email more than once over the weekend, and Monday we're both going to be here all day, I think.
We'll be here. We'll be here for the next month.
Yeah, we're going to be around.
So, so you can just send an email to both of us, and whoever's able to answer it first will be able to get back to you. So if the supplier offers voluntary green products in mass but does not use mass class 1 to satisfy those products, does the supplier need to mention that anywhere in the filing? No. The green products is really only documented because we're required to do some stuff with them for Reggie, but that they can only count towards the retirement of Reggie allowances if they are RPS class 1. So that's the only type of green products we care about in the context of RPS compliance filings. So if you have a green product that doesn't use mass class 1 recs to meet it, then you do not need to document that anywhere in the filing.
There's another question that looks like we've missed. Who is the POC? Oh, point of contact. That was us.
Yeah.
Right. That's your primary care physician. It's the point of contact. Yes.
So I think that's all we have.
We will sit here for.
Yeah, we'll wait another minute.
For a few more minutes.
If people
we talk about the Red Sox or something. No, let's not talk about the Red Sox. The less said about the Red Sox, the better. This year.
So, but if there are more questions, you can always direct them to us. I'd say send it to both of us, and again, whoever gets back to you first, we'll get back to you as soon as possible. So, okay, we will email the final webinar out to the group. So we'll send a link out, and it will be posted very soon. If not today, then early next week, Monday or Tuesday, and we'll send out a notice to retail suppliers that it's been posted and a link to where it's posted.
Yeah, we have one very minor correction in the workbook. It's just the wrong date in the text of a couple of one or two cells. Two cells. So we'll send that out with today's date, and if we have a link, will we have a link later today?
Yeah, it'll be on the Green Communities website.
Yeah. If you happen to know the Green Communities website at DOER's web pages, the links will be there. But we'll try to send that out. We'll send that out when we send out the corrected workbook, and just make sure as you go along that you end up using finally for your filing the most recent workbook. You will all get them. I don't think there's anyone in the last mailing.
So, all right, I think we can probably wrap it up a little early with that.
I'm going to sit here for a couple. I think.
Come on. But we don't have any more questions, so.
We had more than half of the compliance filers did register for the webinar, which is good, and some are so experienced they really don't need the help, or they were not available today, or they just couldn't schedule it themselves. But in any case, we would definitely prefer your questions sooner than later, whether it's by email or whatever. It's better to have a stupid question than to have errors coming in with your filings.
Agreed.
And if errors come in, we deal with them as always. We really want to do our best to help everyone. Try to make it go smoothly. And we appreciate your cooperation as we do so. To the person who wrote, have a nice weekend. You have a nice weekend too, all of you.
All right. Doesn't look like any more are coming in, so again, just feel free to email us. But with that, we'll close the webinar, and we'll be contacting you about it when it gets posted.
So, Mike, when is the sun going to shine next?
Tomorrow.
Oh, good. Oh, thank goodness.
All right. All right. Bye, everyone.